This is episode 88 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Anthony Bale. I'm Professor of Medieval Studies at Birkbeck College in the University of London, and I was one of the academic advisors for the Jews, Money, Myth exhibition at the Jewish Museum London. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
So we do have records of Shakespearean players in the Elizabethan era that are also in the roles of the London Masters of Defense. So we know that at least one or two of the actors were highly trained swordsmen. And just as a baseline in this time period, you had to know how to use a sword. You just didn't wander around without knowing at least the fundamentals of fencing.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When Hamlet and Laertes duel in the final act of Shakespeare's Hamlet, they're using a very specific style of fencing called rapier and dagger fencing. It's called for in the stage directions and the dialogue of the text as well. Other plays, like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, as well as King Lear, also use very specific fencing terminology that demonstrates a knowledge of contemporary fencing styles at the highest level of the fencing industries going on in Shakespeare's lifetime. Shakespeare's indoor playhouse, the Blackfriars, was even a professional fencing school before it was bought by the Burbages for use as a theater. But what does that mean William Shakespeare knew about fencing? What does this say about the culture he was living in that they had fencing as such a normal part of everyday life? And did Shakespeare work with some of the famous fencing masters of the 16th century, like Rocco Bonetti, Vincento Saviolo, and others? Here to take us back to the 1590s, as Shakespeare was writing some of his most famous fight scenes in plays like Romeo and Juliet, Richard II, and even Henry V, to share with us where the life of William Shakespeare overlaps with the history of fencing and explore where Shakespeare learned about swordsmanship, as well as the role of professional fencing in theater, is our guest professional fight coordinator for stage and film, Jared Kirby. Jared has been involved in Western martial arts and combat for stage and screen for nearly 25 years. He teaches in New York City and has choreographed fights off-Broadway nationally in London and Sydney, Australia. As a fight director, Jared has worked with stars such as Peter Skarsgård, Steve Guttenberg, Cameron Douglas, and has trained actors and stunt performers who are working on hit shows and films. Jared is a member of Actors Equity and SAG-AFTRA. Jared has worked on productions such as Titus Andronicus, Hamlet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Cyrano, Romeo and Juliet, and numerous others from the works of William Shakespeare. Among his numerous production credits for the works of Shakespeare, a few of his most memorable fight directing credits include Hamlet at the Classic Stage Company at the Lucille Lortel Theatre, and multiple shows for the New Vic Theatre in London. He's the president of Combat Con in Las Vegas, past president of Art of Combat, and served for 6 years on the board of the International Order of the Sword and Pen. Jared currently teaches fencing at SUNY Purchase, or Lawrence College, and is a Master of Arms through the Martinez Academy of Arms. He teaches a variety of workshops across the U.S. and around the world, including the prestigious Tom Todoroff Conservatory, the New York Conservatory of Dramatic Arts, the Patty Crean International Art of the Sword Workshop, and the International Sword Fighting and Martial Arts Convention, just to name a few. Jared is the editor and one of the translators of the Italian Rapier Combat, the first complete professional translation of Capoferro. He is also the editor and wrote the introduction for The School of Fencing by Domenico Angelo and annotated by Maestro Jeanette Acosta Martinez. Most recently, The Gentleman's Guide to Dueling was released in February 2014, and a reprint of Donald McBain's The Expert Swordsman Companion was released in January of 2017. Hello, Jared. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Who were the Italian fencing masters in 16th century England?
The Italian fencing masters in 16th century England, there were two or three. The first one is Rocco Bonetti. He's the first one to show up in London. The other one of note is Vincento Saviolo. And then there's also Geronimo, which we'll talk about more later. Could be Italian, could not be.
Why were they coming to England instead of practicing in Italy? Since the style of fighting was Italian fighting, what was the draw to immigrate?
The reason that these masters moved to England, there's a couple of different reasons that we can talk about. One of which is primarily in that time period, there are two main schools of rapier fencing, and that's Spanish and Italian. And everywhere else in Europe did one of those. So the Germanic areas, in France, in England, everybody hired either Spanish or Italian fencing masters. And so you'll see, as you move into the 17th century, you'll actually see period translations of some of the rapier masters. Like one named Giganti was translated both into French and German. So it was the way of fencing with that sword. And so everybody had to have a master from one of those two places. Well, didn't have to, but if you were cool, you had to have one. So that led to Spanish masters coming to England. But when we're looking at Elizabethan England, we're looking at a queen that launches this Elizabethan Renaissance. And to have the Renaissance, the Elizabethan Renaissance piggybacks off the Italian Renaissance, which had happened long before. And so they were fascinated with everything Italian. In the second half of the 16th century, there are more Italian works translated into English than almost any other time period. They wanted it all, poetry, any kind of arts, and this included the martial arts. So to come to England, you had this untapped resource of students that wanted to learn the rapier of the gentleman, right? There was an indigenous sword, which the London Masters of Defense, which were a local guild of fencing masters, would teach the common man. And that's something that people would learn. But the rapier was what everybody was doing. And so in that kind of a time period, whatever was popular, you needed to learn. So going to Italy just made sense versus Spain, which was old news at that point to them. Not so fond of the Spanish by that point. So they're looking at these Italian masters.
It's like a brand name, it sounds like, where, you know, you wanted the best, you wanted Italian.
Right. Yeah, you have to think of the gentry of this time period as our, as our stars of this day and age. So if so-and-so is wearing it, well, then I have to as well.
What does it look like for them to emigrate? So they come to Italy. I guess I'm surprised that the English didn't go to Italy. Instead, there was enough of a draw for the Italians to be the ones that traveled. And what was the immigration process like for them? Did they just walk into England and hang a shingle, or was there, some other immigration process?
So to answer that, kind of piggybacking on the last question, that will answer that a little bit as well, is the third reason that is speculation, but we seem to have a little bit of information that would reference them as having the responsibilities of spies. So the first, Rocco Bonetti, is traveling in and out of England for many years. And we know he goes up through Scotland. And so we just don't know exactly what was happening there. So it's quite possible that it's a situation where Bonetti comes over for political purposes, for spying, whether for Italy or for double agent or whatever, whatever could be. Maybe he was the Bond of his time. We don't know. But he was there and therefore set up shop. We also know that he leaves again. So it's not like he just came and decided, I want to be a fencing master, opened a school, and then did that forever. His first school gets repossessed basically after he disappears again for years. He's off doing something. And this is where spy work is an answer, maybe not the answer. But when he comes back, he has to enlist some really high names in the nobility to get his stuff back and open his second school. So as far as the process of immigration to move, for the Italians to move to London and set up shop, there's nothing formalized that I know of. In this day and age, you came, if you wanted to stay, you did exactly that. You stayed, you bought stuff, it helped, where what we're talking about are gentlemen who have the money, right? So actually, come to think of it, very little has changed in that sense. If you have enough money, you can move anywhere and they'll say, oh yeah, here's a visa, right? I think it's $500,000 or something, and you can go just about anywhere.
Now, you mentioned different Italians operating different fencing schools, and I want to ask about Vincento Saviolo. Excuse my Italian there, but did he operate his fencing school out of the same building as the Blackfriars Playhouse?
Vincento Saviolo operated his school in a different location than the Blackfriars, where Bonetti had set up his shop. So what happens is when Bonetti comes back and sets up, he buys this space in the Blackfriars, and then he spends a huge amount of sum to furnish it. And in fact, I have a listing of the furnishings that they had when they repossess all this stuff, basically, when they take it. They took an inventory of all the furniture that they took from it, and it's just expensive stuff. But again, he's teaching the nobility, so to do that and get them to come down to that area to take their lessons in his school, it had to be a beautiful space for them to train. And he also had to have a second room kind of in the back where he would give his private lessons. Many masters had that, which you were supposedly, that's where you learned the volta secreta, the secret thrust of that master that nobody could answer. Okay, so that aside. But we also know that Bonetti doesn't actually get to be there very long. He's setting up that school in 84, 85, and he's dead by 87. And he dies in a debtor's prison. At some point, he couldn't have been in there for more than a year, maybe a year and a half before he's arrested and then subsequently dies.
Geronimo, the son of Rocco Bonetti, took over the fencing school at the Blackfriars before it was bought by the Burbages. Do you think the fencing school played into the value of that location for the Burbages? And this would be William Shakespeare as well. I mean, I'm talking about the Blackfriars Playhouse, that they didn't actually start playing plays there until 1609, but this was a property they pursued well before then.
Right. What happens when Bonetti goes away, we can suppose that Geronimo is continuing to teach in that space until it gets shut down. As far as we know from the records of the Blackfriars, it's completely shut down, the furnishings removed before the Burbages end up buying it. I've found no references of a crossover there, and Lord knows I tried. Part of my mission with this was to find that piece of information, that document somewhere that showed Saviolo and Shakespeare having a beer or, training or something. So part of my interest in pursuing this book was to locate Saviolo's school and to find out more about that time period, because they're all wandering around the same streets. So unfortunately, with the actual Blackfriars space that the Burbages get, there doesn't seem to be any crossover, because Saviolo's school is in a completely different location when he sets up shop.
Where was Saviolo's school?
In my book, that's one of my proudest moments, was being able to identify the closest place for his school. We have no idea. Authors throughout the 20th century had different suppositions, but none of them came actually close to meeting the data points that we had. And we only have 4 data points to go off of to triangulate where his school could have been.
So do you have the location of Saviolo's theater on a map somewhere? And I know you said we don't know specifically, but where did you theorize the closest spot was most likely to be?
Luckily, when I was researching the location of Saviolo's school, one of the things that I was able to find that none of the other authors had access to was in England, when you're tearing up the ground to build something new, there's something like 1 or 2 years where you have to sit on it and let archaeologists dig before you're allowed to build your new skyscraper in London. Well, in this process, it was in, I think, 92 when they did this in the area that I'm saying that they actually found this little street with a well in it at the end of the street. And that's one of the data points. It said his school was at the sign of the Red Lion in the little street where the well is. It's the only place that is also within a bow shot of Belsavage, another data point that we have to reference. Nobody would have known about that until this archaeology finding. And so I was able to say and go back to maps from the 16th century, and you can see this little street, but there was never a well drawn on it.
So despite not being able to find a connection between the Burbages and Saviolo or Bonetti directly, which I will join you in holding out hope that there is some archaeological find yet undiscovered that will make that connection. But does the lack of that kind of connection mean that fencing masters were not important to Elizabethan theater, or did they play a role in companies like the Lord Chamberlain's men to help with their fight choreography in the 16th century?
The fight choreography of Shakespeare's time is one of those big areas that we just have very little information on. So without Pepys' diary and things like that, we really have very little accounts of what's happening and almost no way of knowing how they approached the fights. Now, that said, I can share my opinions. They were all trained swordsmen. There's no way around that in that time period, but they also weren't gentlemen. So the likelihood of them having access to train with people like Bonetti or Saviolo, I mean, for Bonetti alone, we know what he charged. And it was an exorbitant rate that a common person wouldn't be able to afford, and he still couldn't pay his rent. So the likelihood of them training with Bonetti or Saviolo or Geronimo is less likely. But of course, we know that they also have ties to the nobility, right? They're getting costumes from these people. They're performing for them. It's not unlikely that they would have worked with them or crossed paths with them or consulted. I'd like to think when we have plays that are so specific, like Romeo and Juliet, actually using Italian fencing terminology, that they would have sought out that Italian master to say, hey, what's this fencing look like? And approach that fight that way. Have Mercutio with an English backsword and Tybalt with a rapier.
Yes, I hope so.
But we have no way of knowing what their actual process was. We do know that they have had foiled blades for training and for competitions. So when Hamlet says, bring me the foils, he doesn't mean the modern car antennas that we reference as foils. He means a foiled sword, meaning dulled and rounded at the point. at the very least, with rapiers being a thrusting weapon. They would also, in this time period, put a button on the end of it that was about the size of a tennis ball.
Wow. My son is a foil fencer. He's 10, and it's hilarious that you call them car antennas. That's what I thought of when he brought home his weapon for the first time. So it's very funny. I didn't know about the tennis balls. That's exciting. So maybe not Bonetti and Saviolo and Geronimo necessarily, but were fencing masters at maybe a lower level, hired by playing companies like Shakespeare to train actors in correct swordplay on stage. I will reference things and characters like Hamlet and King Lear, who needed to present on stage as good swordsmen at a level that, as you mentioned, was higher than the players would have had because of their station. But at the same time, for their audience, if the character that was a high noble character didn't understand how to fight with a sword, that would have been obvious to the audience and taken away from the reality of the production. So was there a way for the playing company to bridge that gap in terms of training for their players?
So we do have records of Shakespearean players in the Elizabethan era that are also in the roles of the London Masters of Defense. So we know that at least one or two of the actors were highly trained swordsmen. And just as a baseline in this time period, you had to know how to use a sword. You just didn't wander around without knowing at least the fundamentals of fencing, because that was not just for dueling, that weapon was for self-defense. I think that your basic actor would have an understanding of swordplay and be able to perform it, but we also know that some of them had even more skill. Maybe they didn't have the money and the access to people like Bonetti and Saviolo, but they definitely sought out training to be better sword fighters.
Do we have records of Shakespeare specifically working with fencing guild or the London Fencing Guild, or can we connect Shakespeare to this kind of training?
Unfortunately, we can't connect Shakespeare to any kind of sword training so far. I have not given up hope, but this book actually probably would have been released 3 to 5 years sooner, except that I kept putting it off because I swore to God I was going to find that document. I really wanted to find that piece that connected them. Because if you talk to just about anybody, well, I've heard this over and over again, and it's been written in the 20th century. You can find very authors that are really on point with their history, and they talk about Shakespeare's Italian fencing masters. Oh, and people will say, oh, Shakespeare trained with an Italian fencing master. And it's just one of these myths that's been perpetuated both in writing and then over and over again in storytelling, when we have absolutely no proof that that ever happened. But it's a cool idea, so people keep saying it. A lot of my research for this book was exactly for this purpose, that there were a lot of things that people were saying because people had always said that. But the more I dug, the less I could find that primary research to validate it, and sometimes then finding primary research that contradicted the myths.
I think it's the prevalence of such detailed fencing terminology like Tybalt and, Hamlet and Laertes. They're using a very popular style of fencing that was not popular when Hamlet was supposed to be set in the 1400s, but it was hugely popular for that 52-year period when William Shakespeare was living. And so it's just very, very specific to his lifetime. I think it's tantalizing to think Shakespeare must have had some kind of training. So hopefully we'll find some connection, or at least answers to why was he, able to be so specific somewhere down the line.
I can help a little bit with explaining how Shakespeare got so detail-oriented in his fencing terminology. It's because of this book. When Saviolo published his book, the first half of it is a fencing treatise, so you can actually learn how Saviolo fenced. The second half is a code duello. a book of dueling. And that's what my book is a republication of. And I updated to modern punctuation and modern British English to make it easier to read, because it's still really hard to read. A code duello reads like a law book. But this book is released, and if not the next play, I believe, if not the one after that, is Romeo and Juliet. So there's no reason that that's a coincidence. Shakespeare had to have access to this information because these are Italian fencing terms that Saviolo had just published about: the passato, the staccata. Things like that are relevant in these circles at this time. And like you said, at this time period, for Hamlet and Laertes, defense, rapier, and dagger, he's alluding to a foreign weapon, right? Something that had not caught on yet, but was starting to. Eventually, by the early 17th century, even the London Masters of Defense allowed their people to fence their prize fights, and with the rapier being one of the choices. Not so when Rocco Bonetti was there.
So before we leave this idea completely behind, I want to ask one more time about the Blackfriars. When the Burbages bought it, even though it was shut down and closed up and the furniture had been sold, did Geronimo still own it? Would the Burbages have been buying it from him, or had it been taken over through what would be modern day called bankruptcy, or whatever the equivalent was in the 16th century?
Yeah. So when the Burbages bought the Blackfriars, you want to think about it as a repossessed bank-owned property that they picked up. We know that because Saviolo moves to London most likely in 1587, which is the same year that Bonetti is dying in a debtor's jail. So once again, in my imagination, Saviolo went and visited him and said hi one last time before Bonetti dies. And I say that half in jest because we know that Geronimo then teaches with Saviolo for a span of 7 or 8 years. So we know that Geronimo couldn't have been at the Blackfriars School or couldn't have continued working there because he was working for Saviolo.
Well, I know we would love to learn more about this topic. This is fascinating, and your book is obviously one major resource that we should check out. But what are some of your favorite books and resources that you would recommend for somebody that wants to explore this topic further?
For those who are interested in exploring this topic further, from that time period, it really getting into people like, unfortunately, Bonetti didn't write a book, so we don't know anything about his fencing system. But you can become familiar with things like Saviolo. There's another fencing master you can read in English named de Grassi. And while his book was published in 1570 in Italian, this is one more book that was published, translated and published in Elizabethan England. In 1594, it's translated into English. So that's another book that you can read that would have been fresh and relevant to Shakespeare at that time. You can also look now into the Spanish rapier fencing, which I don't think had much of an influence at this time period, even though there are allusions like when he speaks of Tybalt as a mathematician, as a fencer in the way that he's described, it is reminiscent of the way that the Spanish fencer is known to have been. Cold, calculating. The entire system of Spanish rapier fencing is based on the geometry of a circle that you and your adversary are on opposite sides of, and fencing on the circumference of this circle. It's possible that that was something that Shakespeare's alluding to as well. So things like that system was created by a fencing master named Carranza. He only has one book out, but his main student, Navarez, published, I think, 13 in his lifetime. So those are things that if you want to look at that, you could go into a little bit more.
We will definitely link to those resources in today's show notes. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Can I pack coffee into a book and bring that?
Yes, I think so. Like you hide it in the cupboard. Yeah. I think that'd be fine.
No, probably at least right now in the last 3-4 years, the book that I've read multiple times and I'm almost ready to read again is The War of Art.
I've read that book. I like that book.
I love it.
That's an excellent choice.
Each time that I read it, there's a different part of it that jumps out at me. And I like to think that means that I'm progressing.
I think that's what it means. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you'd be well set up on your deserted island with that choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So the next book, actually, I am putting out is all about Shakespeare. Very relevant. I don't mind announcing now that it is a book that I'm working on with the artistic director of the York Shakespeare Company, a gentleman named Seth Dewar. And we are looking at all the violence in Shakespeare, but from a performance side. So since I'm a fight director for screen and stage and have been for the last 25 years almost, the thing that interests me most when I'm crafting choreography for a fight is to use that violence to tell the story, to reveal character in a way that the words don't. And so that fight becomes a seamless part of the story that's being told. Well, with Shakespeare in particular, I love it. I love Shakespeare. But we have very few times where he straight up says they fight. So we know. So those are addressed. Then we go into all the implied violence, right? If a character says, "Why did thou strike me?" Well, you probably need the other character to strike him.
To strike them, yes.
So there's all the implicit violence and explicit violence, implicit violence, and then the potential violence. There's so much that I find in modern performances of Shakespeare because our society has become so peaceful, which I applaud, right? That's the path I want us to be going down. Unfortunately, that seeps into our storytelling. And the plays of Shakespeare have much more potential violence and physicality in them than I often see performed. So we, in this book, are also addressing all the potential violence. Absolutely not saying, hey, you got to do it this way. We are just creating a resource for actors, directors, other fight directors to be able to go, here's some possibilities. And one of the catalysts for this is because as a fight director, of course, barely a year goes by that I'm not choreographing a Hamlet. But I often say I get hired to choreograph the duel in Hamlet. And then I address the other 6 moments of violence in that play. But I rarely ever have a director look at it and go, hey, Hamlet needs to get physical with his mother in the closet, right? Yes. Otherwise, and unfortunately, I've actually seen this, a poor Gertrude that has to say, "What wilt thou murder me?" And all she has is an angry Hamlet shaking his finger at her. Like, well, that doesn't, if my son did that to me, I would not assume that he was going to murder me. So I go into, when I'm in that production, then I talk to the director and we examine that scene and try to craft enough physicality.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing with poor Ophelia, right? Ophelia, we get this sweetheart of a gal who has to have an experience happen with Hamlet that we only get, I think, 12 or 16 lines. The next time we see her, daddy died and she's insane.
Yeah, it was a traumatic experience that you miss because it happens in the action, not in the text. Yeah.
And so with what I like to arm productions with, or at least provide as a possibility, is to also have Hamlet be a part of that descent to madness. So to be, the nunnery scene can be so physicalized. And I don't mean punches and slaps. I just mean grabbing and throwing and shoving. And when I did it, I smeared her lipstick upside her face.
Wow.
On got it, given me one face and you paint yourself another. Just moments like this, so that when they come out and she's in a pile on the ground, it's not just her collapsing and sobbing. It is her in hair tousled, lipstick smeared, makeup everywhere, maybe, like the loss of her love.
Yeah.
As well as then soon the loss of her father. And
wow.
I've just found that gives the actress so much more to work with in her madness.
That's fantastic.
So these are ways that potential violence can reveal character and enhance productions. And so the next 2 books, it'll be a 2-volume series because we can't get it all in one. And that should be out late next year. That's or fantastic. Early the year after.
We will definitely be looking forward to that. And tell us where we can come and see a production of Hamlet that you're going to be involved in, because now it's on our list.
Nothing right now.
Okay.
Actually, what is the next thing? Next thing I'm working on is at Millersville University in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. One of my students teaches there. So I just went down and we had fight auditions and then an entire weekend of fight training to get them ready for a production of She Kills Monsters.
Cool.
Phenomenal play. Modern.
Jared, Kirby, this is amazing. This topic is really exciting about fencing in Elizabethan England, and definitely just the impact of how important understanding the fights and the violence in Shakespeare's plays is to what you understand about characters like Ophelia and Hamlet, and indeed Shakespeare's life itself. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us here and share this history with us. It's been wonderful having you visit.
Well, thank you. These questions were wonderful. So the fact that you picked up on this, I can talk about it all day, and your questions were wonderful. It was great to chat about this.
Thank you very much. To join in on this conversation with your thoughts and questions about fencing, swordsmanship, and playing companies in Shakespeare's England, be sure to check out today's show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your comments, but there's extra history and links to resources Jared recommends, along with full details on where you can read Jared's books or connect with him for your next fight choreography project. Find all this and more at CassidyCash.com/episode88. That's CassidyCash.com/EP88. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and that you'll be spending that New Year here with us on That Shakespeare Life, because I will definitely be back next Monday with even more Shakespeare history. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.